A sudden power outage had plunged the office into darkness, and staring at the dead screens of their computers seemed like an absurd exercise, worthy of characters in some philosophical novel about the meaninglessness of human existence. She walked through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past small city parks with peeling paint on the swing sets and cars parked bumper to bumper. So close they looked like a gigantic puzzle designed to drive you mad, trying to pull out without scraping the car next to you. She remembered she needed to stop by the corner deli for a loaf of sourdough because that morning, David, her husband, had complained that yesterday's loaf already had the consistency of an old shoe sole. Their apartment was a fifth-floor unit in a 9-story building from the 72nds, one of those eras when architects seemed to believe firmly in standardized happiness, mass-producing identical matchboxes with identical balconies and tiny kitchens. The building greeted her with its familiar scent, a mix of the neighbors' cooking, the dust from old cast-iron radiators, and something else that could only be described as the aroma of many years of shared life. Sarah walked up the stairs, counting the steps, an old childhood habit she hadn't shaken in her 38 years. She remembered how she and David, 15 years ago, so young and ridiculous in their naive certainty that love fixed everything, had moved into this apartment, inherited from his grandmother. The key turned in the lock with its usual click, and Sarah pushed the door open as she slipped off her shoes. Her feet ached after a full day in heels, and she was already savoring the moment she could change into sweatpants and a soft t-shirt, make a strong cup of tea, and collapse onto the sofa in front of the TV, where some medical or cop show would be on, the kind you could watch with one eye half closed, without paying too much attention to the plot. But instead of the usual silence of an empty apartment, she was met with the sound of a woman's voice coming from the bedroom. It was a playful voice, slightly husky, the tone women sometimes use when they want to sound both seductive and self-assured. "Honey, where are you? I've got a surprise for you." Sarah froze in the entryway, her purse still in her hand, which suddenly felt unbearably heavy, as if someone had slipped a couple of bricks into it without her noticing. Her brain refused to process the information. Thoughts swirled chaotically, like frightened birds beating against the walls of her skull. "There's a voice in our bedroom. It's a woman's voice. It's not the TV. David never watches TV in the bedroom. It's a real woman." At that moment, David shot out of the bedroom, wearing only a pair of jeans, barefoot, his hair a mess, and the expression of someone caught doing something so shameful that no excuse could possibly suffice. He stood still in the middle of the hallway, and Sarah, with a strange, distant clarity, noticed a fresh hickey reddening his neck, a bright raspberry-colored blotch that looked almost comical against the paleness of his terrified face. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling as if he were trying to speak during an earthquake. "It's not what you think. I can explain everything." But Sarah was no longer listening to his pathetic attempts to improvise a believable version of events. With the calm that comes in moments of absolute shock, when emotions have not yet managed to break through the armor of stupor, she walked past him and headed for the bedroom. David tried to stop her by grabbing her arm, but she shook him off with a sharp movement, without even looking at him, as if he were an annoying fly to be swatted away. In the bedroom, on their queen-sized bed, with the sheets they had chosen together 3 years ago at Crate and Barrel, lay Jessica, the wife of Mark. Mark was an acquaintance of them both. David worked at the same company as him, and they often saw each other at corporate events. Jessica, always so proper in public, with her perfect hair and flawless makeup, was now lying on the wrinkled sheets, dressed in a red lace lingerie set. It was exactly the shade Sarah had always considered tacky, and which apparently men found incredibly attractive. "Sarah," Jessica stammered, desperately grabbing the comforter to try to cover herself. "Oh my God, we didn't mean for... it just... happened." Sarah, in silence, pulled her phone out of her purse. Her hands didn't tremble. She felt surprisingly serene, as if her mind had temporarily disconnected all emotions, leaving only cold logic and the capacity to act. She opened the camera and started recording. The bedroom, the bed, the terrified Jessica, who no longer looked like a seductress but rather a guilty child, caught stealing cookies from the jar. "Sarah, don't, please." David's voice behind her sounded broken, almost hysterical. "Let's talk. Let me explain. But she kept recording, methodically panning the phone, capturing every detail. The woman's clothes scattered on the floor, David's shirt on the back of the chair, 2 half-finished glasses of wine on the nightstand. She recorded it like one would record a crime scene, with the same dispassionate thoroughness used to document evidence. When she finished, she turned calmly and gave David a long, steady look, so full of coldness that he instinctively took a step back. 15 years, she said in a low voice, but so clearly that each word fell into the silence like a stone down a well. 15 years ironing your shirts, making your favorite pot roast on Sundays, putting up with your mother and her endless advice on how to run a home. 15 years putting my dream of going back to grad school on hold because your career was more important. 15 years. She paused, and in that pause, there was something terrible. It wasn't screaming or hysteria, but precisely that icy silence in which a true, calculated revenge matures far more fearsome than any emotional outburst. And you know what the funniest part is? Sarah continued, a strange smile touching her lips that made David's blood run cold. Mark, Jessica's husband, just got promoted. He's the director of your entire department now. I wonder how he'll react when he finds out that his senior manager, his right-hand man, his trusted guy, is sleeping with his wife during work hours. David's face went from pale to an ashen gray, like the old plaster in the building's lobby. "No," he whispered. "Sarah, no, not that, please. He'll destroy me. It'll ruin my career. I won't be able to find another job in this industry. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows us," Sarah repeated, arching an eyebrow in mock surprise. "Us. What a beautiful pronoun. But I'm afraid, honey, that us doesn't exist anymore." She turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving David and Jessica alone with their terror and their belated regret. In the entryway, Sarah stopped, leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes. Now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade, the emotions were starting to surface. Not hysteria, no, but something deeper and more painful, as if an internal wound she never knew she had been torn open. But she didn't cry. Instead, she opened her phone, found Mark's contact. They had exchanged numbers at a company dinner while talking about organizing a summer barbecue, a plan that never materialized, and sent him the video with a brief message. The message sent with a silent swoosh, and Sarah felt a strange satisfaction. Not joy, no, but the feeling of having done the only right thing in that absurd situation. Sarah stood in the entryway, looking at the phone screen, where under the sent video, the word "read" appeared. She turned slowly toward David, who was still frozen in the bedroom doorway, as if hoping that if he didn't move, reality might miraculously change, and the last half hour would turn out to be a bad dream. "You know what I just realized?" she said quietly, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. "You always thought I was dumb, comfortable, submissive, predictable, but dumb. And that was your biggest mistake, David, because I remember absolutely everything. Every conversation you had about Mark, every complaint about how much you depend on him, every time you mentioned he could bury anyone's career in our industry with a single phone call. I remember, and now I'm going to use it." End quote. Her voice was even almost conversational, but it was precisely that normality, the tone one might use to talk about the weather or the dinner menu, that made a chill run down David's spine. A hysterical scene he could have handled. He would have soothed the tears, even picked up broken plates, putting on a pained expression. But this calculating coldness was something new, unknown, terrifying. "Sarah, baby." He took a step toward her, holding out his hands in a pleading gesture that seemed both pathetic and fake. "Let's just sit down and talk calmly. I'll tell you how it happened. It was a stupid mistake, a moment of weakness. I love you, only you." "Shut up," Sarah cut him off, and he actually fell silent, stunned that his wife, who had never once raised her voice to him in 15 years, would suddenly speak to him in that tone. "Don't even try." "How many times? How many times did you bring her here, to our bed, while I was working my ass off?" From the bedroom, Jessica emerged, now dressed, but looking as if she had just survived a natural disaster. Her mascara had run in black streaks under her eyes, her lipstick was smeared, and her face, usually hidden behind layers of makeup, now looked tired and old. "Sarah, listen to me," she began, her voice trembling. "I understand how you feel, but let's not make any rash decisions. Let's think." "Think about what?" Sarah turned to her, her gaze so sharp that Jessica instinctively backed away. "About how last month at the company dinner, you were whining to me about how wonderful your Mark was, how he took care of you, how you were planning to have a baby, or about how you went to the bathroom afterward, and David whispered to me that you were, and I quote, pretty, yeah, but dumber than a box of rocks? What exactly do you suggest we think about, Jessica?" Jessica turned pale. It was clear from her face that she hadn't expected this twist, that she hadn't expected the quiet, insignificant Sarah, the one who could be ignored, to turn out to be so composed and ruthless. Sarah's phone vibrated. An incoming call from Mark. She glanced at the screen, then at David and Jessica, and slowly, deliberately, swiped her finger across the screen to accept the call. "Sarah." Mark's voice sounded strangely deep, muffled, as if he were speaking from an enclosed space. "Is it real? The video? Is it real?" "From about an hour ago," Sarah replied calmly. "I got off work early. There was a power outage at the office and they let us go. I guess fate decided it was time for me to know the truth." The silence on the other end of the line was long, heavy, charged with something that sounded like an approaching storm. "Where are they now?" Mark finally asked, and metallic notes appeared in his voice. "They're right here in front of me," Sarah said, looking at the ashen-faced David and Jessica, trying to explain themselves, looking for words that will fix everything. "Funny thing is, I don't think such words exist in the English language." "Put my wife on," Mark demanded. Sarah held the phone out to Jessica, who took it with trembling hands and brought it to her ear. "Mark, honey, I'm so sorry." She began, but Mark cut her off so sharply that even Sarah and David could hear his voice from the earpiece. "Silence. Tomorrow morning at 10, you come to the house, you pack your things, only your things, nothing I bought, and you get out. You have exactly 24 hours. After that, I'm changing the locks." "But Mark, where will I go? I don't have any money. I don't have a job." Jessica's voice broke into a sob, a real, ugly sob with gasps and sniffles. "Those are your problems now?" Mark cut her off. "Should have thought of that sooner. Maybe you can move in with your lover, since you two get along so well. Give the phone back to Sarah." Jessica handed the phone back, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Sarah," Mark's voice softened, but not by much. "We need to meet, to talk. It turns out we have some common interests. If you go'd, tomorrow," Sarah said, feeling a plan, as clear and cold as an architectural blueprint, begin to form in her mind. "Tomorrow at lunch. You know that coffee shop on the corner, next to the bookstore?" "I know it. I'll be there." He paused. "And Sarah, thank you for telling me. Not everyone would have had the guts." He hung up, and the silence that filled the apartment was deafening. David was staring at Sarah with wide eyes, and in his gaze was something she had never seen before. Fear. A primal, animal fear of what she had done, of the consequences that could no longer be stopped. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered. "Mark is going to bury me. He'll call every company. He'll make sure I never get hired anywhere." "I know perfectly well," Sarah said. She pulled her old duffel bag from the hall closet and tossed it to him. "Pack your things. You can go to your mother's house, I don't care. But you don't live here anymore." "This is my apartment," David shouted. "It was my grandmother's. I have a right." "You had a right," Sarah corrected him. "You had a right until the moment you decided marital fidelity was just some nice words in the wedding vows. You know what? I'm calling a good lawyer today. A colleague's niece specializes in divorces. I'm going to find out everything. About the division of assets with proven adultery, about what can be claimed and what can't. It's going to be interesting. I'm ready way, end quote, end quote. Jessica grabbed her purse and ran for the door, but at the threshold, she turned back. "Sarah, please, don't do this," she said, breathless. "I have no one. I have nowhere to go. My parents passed away years ago. My friends are all mutual friends with Mark. They'll turn their backs on me. I'll be alone." "You should have thought of that sooner," Sarah repeated Mark's words, and not a single note trembled in her voice. "When you were getting undressed in my bedroom, when you were lying in my bed, when you were kissing my husband, that's when you should have thought about it." Jessica fled the apartment, and the slamming door sounded like the final chord of the grotesque scene. David was still standing there, duffel bag in his hands, his face a mask of such desperation that for a second Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered the playful voice from the bedroom. "Honey, where are you? I've got a surprise for you." And the compassion evaporated without a trace. "How many times?" she asked quietly. "What?" David didn't understand. "How many times did you two meet? How many times did you lie to my face, going to so-called client meetings and site visits?" David remained silent, his head bowed, and that silence was more eloquent than any answer. "Got it," Sarah nodded. "Pack your bag. You have half an hour. Then I'm changing the locks. I'm calling the locksmith today. Even if I don't stay in this apartment forever after all, it's not legally mine right now. You're leaving. You're just leaving. And until the divorce is final, don't even think about suggesting you'll live here. I don't care whose name is on the deed." End quote. She turned and went into the kitchen, leaving him alone in the hall with his pathetic regret and a piece of luggage that had suddenly become the symbol of his entire shattered life. The coffee shop greeted Sarah with the aroma of freshly ground coffee and cinnamon rolls, a scent normally associated with warmth and comfort, but which now seemed out of place, like someone trying to decorate a funeral home with party streamers. She had arrived 15 minutes early. The previous night had been sleepless, an endless loop of the day's events replaying in her mind, and staying in the apartment, where every corner reminded her of the betrayal, was unbearable. The very walls seemed to have absorbed the knowledge. The air had grown heavy with unasked questions, and the answers she never got from David before he, hunched under the weight of his own guilt, had left for his mother's house with his sorry duffel bag. Mark appeared promptly at 1 o'clock. He was a tall, fit man in his mid-40s, wearing an expensive but understated suit and a face that normally radiated the confidence of a successful man used to being in control. But now, that face was like a mask, hiding something raw, painful, and unhealed. He saw Sarah, nodded, and walked to her table, moving with the caution of someone who has suffered a recent trauma and fears any sudden movement. He sat across from her. The waitress materialized instantly with a menu, but he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Just a double espresso." The waitress left, and they were alone. Two betrayed people who, just the day before, were mere acquaintances from company events, and who today found themselves bound by a common pain and, strangely enough, a common goal. "I didn't sleep at all last night," Mark began, his voice weary, like someone who has been squeezed dry. "I watched that video about 20 times, trying to understand when it started, how I could have missed it, what signs I ignored." "And did you find any answers?" Sarah asked, swirling a cup of now cool tea between her hands. "Only more questions," he said, rubbing his face with his hands. The gesture held so much despair that Sarah suddenly thought that men, it seemed, could suffer just as deeply as women. They just hid it better under layers of socially acceptable behavior. Jessica said she was going to the gym 3 times a week. I even paid for her membership, proud that she was taking care of herself. Turns out she was going to your apartment, to your bed, to see your husband. Sarah managed a humorless smile, as bitter as wormwood. "You know what's most humiliating? I used to iron his shirts. Every Sunday, standing at the ironing board, I made sure his collars were perfect, that he looked impeccable for work, so he would make a good impression even on you, on his bosses. I tried so hard to be a good wife, and he was bringing another man's wife home and sleeping with her on my freshly ironed sheets." Mark winced at the bluntness of her words but said nothing. After all, they both had a right to be blunt after what they had been through. "David called me this morning," he said after a pause. "About 10 times. I didn't pick up. Then he texted me, asking to meet, wanting to explain, saying something about a moment of weakness, about how it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything," Sarah repeated, steel entering her voice. What an interesting phrase. Turns out our entire life together meant less than his moment of weakness, which, judging by their behavior, didn't last just 1 minute or 1 day. To 7 maybe 12, in stirring. The waitress brought the espresso, and Mark drank it in one gulp, as if it were pain medicine, not coffee. "I thought about just destroying his career," he said, placing the empty cup on the saucer. "Making a couple of calls to places where I have connections, explaining the situation. He wouldn't get hired anywhere after this. In our industry, reputation is everything. And sleeping with your boss's wife isn't just unethical, it's professional suicide." 80. "But," Sarah caught the hesitation in his tone. "But it would be too easy." Mark looked her in the eye and she saw something in his gaze that made her tense up. "Too quick. A firing, loss of a job, financial problems. Yes, it's unpleasant, but it can be overcome. People lose jobs all the time and find new ones. Life goes on. For me, that's not enough. I need them to understand what they've lost, to feel it, to wake up every single day with the full weight of their stupidity. I'm start." Sarah listened, and something inside her resonated with those words. It wasn't joy, no, but a grim satisfaction in knowing she wasn't alone in her desire not just to punish, but to make the unfaithful truly comprehend the scale of what they had destroyed. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Collaboration." Mark leaned forward, and a glint appeared in his eyes, one that might have seemed predatory if it hadn't been born of pain. "I know everything about David. His weaknesses, his ambitions, his fears. He's worked under my supervision, even if indirectly, for 15 years. I know him like an open book, and you know things about Jessica that I don't. Women's secrets, conversations, wives have at company dinners, while the husbands talk business. Together, we can make their lives truly unbearable." "Revenge," Sarah said, tasting the word. "I'm talking about justice," Mark corrected her. "About them getting what they deserve. About the price of their pleasure being so high that they regret every minute they spent together." Sarah fell silent, weighing his words. A plan was forming in her mind. Still blurry, imprecise, but beginning to take shape, like a sculpture gradually emerging from a formless lump of clay under a master's hands. "David just submitted a proposal for that new project," she said slowly. "The one set to launch next quarter. He said it was his chance to prove he deserved an even bigger promotion. Whenever. 8. Mark smiled a cold smile. "That proposal hasn't been approved yet, and now it never will be. I'll make sure the project goes to someone else. He can watch his dreams crumble right before his eyes." "And Jessica wanted to open her own beauty salon," Sarah added, remembering a conversation from that same company dinner. "She was saving money, planning, dreaming. She said she'd already found a space." "A space that I was paying for," Mark nodded. "The rent came out of our joint account. I closed that account yesterday. She has no money, no job, and now she won't have a business." They looked at each other, and in that gaze was a silent but crystal-clear understanding. David sat in the small bedroom of his childhood, where he had once taped posters of baseball teams to the walls and dreamed of a great future. He stared at his phone screen, where a message from Mark's assistant glowed. "The project meeting has been postponed. A new date will be announced." It was the third postponement in a week. Even for someone with his capacity for self-delusion, it was becoming clear that there would be no meeting, that the project he had pinned so many hopes on, the one that was supposed to be his triumph and proof of his professionalism, was slipping through his fingers like sand. His mother bustled around the kitchen, clattering pots and pans with an ostentation that made her displeasure clear. She had taken her son in, yes, but a silent judgment hung in the air of her small 2-bedroom apartment like an invisible fog that made it hard to breathe. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations, but her looks, filled with disappointment and mute reproach, were more eloquent than any words. "How did I get here?" David thought, the question circling in his head in an endless, exhausting, and futile loop. Were a few hours of pleasure worth losing everything? His home, his wife, his career, his self-respect? But the honest answer to that question required admitting his own stupidity, and he wasn't ready for that yet, clinging to pathetic excuses like, "It just happened," and "I didn't want to hurt her," as if those trivial phrases could somehow mitigate the scale of the catastrophe he himself had caused. At work, the situation became increasingly suffocating. Mark didn't yell, didn't make scenes, didn't call him into his office for a dressing down. But it was precisely the icy politeness with which he now addressed David that was more terrifying than any scandal. Every "David, please prepare the report" sounded like a death sentence. Every meeting he wasn't invited to was a reminder that he was no longer part of the inner circle, that the career he had built over 15 years was crumbling before his eyes, slowly, methodically, without a single formal infraction he could protest. Jessica, meanwhile, had settled into a cheap rental on the outskirts of the city, in a 60 Seconds era walk-up that smelled of damp and other people's lives, where the next-door neighbors argued at night and the window overlooked dumpsters and a dilapidated garage. The money she had saved for the salon had been wiped out after paying the first month's rent and the security deposit, and finding a job proved impossible. She realized that Mark truly did know a lot of people in the city. Everywhere she applied, she was politely rejected, citing a lack of openings, even as help wanted signs remained taped to the very doors she walked through with her head held low. She called David every day, her voice growing more hysterical, more desperate. "Do you realize what's happening? They're destroying us, methodically, systematically ruining our lives." "Arkans." "I know," David would reply wearily, staring at the ceiling of the room where he had spent his childhood and to which he had returned at 38, a complete failure. "I feel it every day. Mark won't even look at me. To him, I don't exist as a professional anymore. I've become a ghost in my own office. We have to do something," Jessica would cry into the phone, her sobs pathetic and helpless. "What if I talk to Sarah? Apologize. Explain we didn't mean for it to happen. Do you think that would help?" David smiled bitterly. "Did you see her face that day? I've never seen Sarah like that. She was like a machine, cold, calculating. I didn't even know she was capable of it." And Sarah, at that very moment, was sitting in the same apartment she had shared with David for 15 years, talking on the phone with Mark, discussing the next steps of their meticulously planned revenge. The apartment felt more spacious without David, the air cleaner, although the void that had formed where their shared life used to be sometimes hit her with a wave of loneliness, especially at night when she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and realized no one would ask how her day was. "I found out something interesting," Mark was saying, his voice holding that special intonation of someone who has unearthed important information. "Remember how Jessica used to brag about her friend in New York, the one who supposedly owned a cosmetics company? She was going to ask her for a job if she couldn't find anything here." "What about it?" Sarah asked. "She doesn't exist," Mark said flatly. "That friend was just a story to project a glamorous life. Jessica has a tendency to embellish reality. Remember how she talked about her supposed modeling career in her youth? The other day, I came across one of her old high school classmates on social media. We got to talking. Turns out, in her youth, Jessica worked as a sales clerk at The Gap. No modeling agencies." Also, Mark fell silent, processing the information, and Sarah imagined him sitting in his imposing office, furnished with expensive furniture, where everything screamed status and success, realizing how many years he had lived with a woman who lied about herself as easily and naturally as she breathed. "That means she has nowhere to go," he summarized. "Absolutely nowhere." "Good," Sarah replied. "Let them feel what it's like to be at the bottom, no money, no connections, no future. It's context dated." "David is desperate too," she added, and it was strange to say her husband's name with such detachment, as if talking about a stranger. "His mother called me yesterday, trying to convince me to give him a second chance. Said all men are like that you have to forgive." "And what did you say to her?" Mark asked, intrigued. "I told her that if all men are like that, then I don't need any of them." Sarah ran her hand over the table, the same table where she and David had eaten breakfast every morning for 15 years. "And then I asked her if she would have forgiven David's father if he had cheated on her with his boss's wife. She got quiet and hasn't called back." Mark let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You know, sometimes I think we're a lot alike. Both betrayed, both deceived, and both unwilling to just let it go and move on as if nothing happened." "I'm not really." "Because something did happen," Sarah replied softly. "Something happened that changed us. We're not the people we were a month ago. We're someone else, harder, colder, and it's probably not right, but I can't do it any other way." She looked out the window where dusk was beginning to fall, painting the sky in unsettling shades of purple and gray, and thought that revenge was a strange thing. It didn't bring happiness. It didn't heal wounds, but it provided a grim satisfaction, an illusion of control over a situation that had spun out of control the moment David first brought Jessica into their bedroom. David, in time, recovered enough to realize he had to act. He started small, with cautious insinuations in the designated smoking area, where colleagues gathered for breaks and where the most candid conversations always took place, the ones that would later spread through the office, growing with details and conjectures, like a snowball rolling downhill. Standing by the window, he'd take a drag from his cigarette with the nervousness of someone on the verge of a breakdown and drop carefully rehearsed lines from the night before. "You know, Mark's been a little off lately, making impulsive, poorly thought-out decisions. Remember that contract with the new suppliers? I warned him the terms weren't favorable, but he didn't listen. Now the budget's taking a hit." Ethan, a young analyst who had recently joined the department and didn't yet understand the subtleties of office politics, nodded with interest. "Yeah, I've noticed the tension too. I just thought it was about the quarterly results." "Arno, the results have nothing to do with it." David lowered his voice to a confidential whisper, creating the illusion that he was sharing something important, almost secret. "Mark is having personal problems, family issues, and it's affecting his work. I can't go into details, but believe me, a person in his state shouldn't be making major decisions." He stubbed out his cigarette with the air of someone who had said too much and returned to the office, leaving behind a trail of half-truths that he hoped would germinate in his colleagues' minds and chip away at Mark's reputation. It was a pathetic attempt to undermine his boss's authority, but David, like a drowning man, was grasping at straws, not understanding that such manipulations required far more skill than he possessed. Jessica, meanwhile, chose a different tactic. She decided to slander Sarah, portraying herself as a victim of Sarah's cold, calculated cruelty. She called mutual acquaintances the same women they met at company events, who knew Sarah as David's quiet, unassuming wife, and told them her version of events, carefully twisting the facts. "You have no idea, Olivia, what she's doing." Jessica sobbed into the phone, her voice trembling with an artistry that would have done a professional actress proud. "She's teamed up with Mark, and they're methodically destroying our lives. I understand we made a mistake, but that's no reason to organize a witch hunt. David has lost all his projects. I can't find a job anywhere. And Sarah, she's enjoying our suffering. You know, I always thought she was so nice, but it turns out she's a viper." "I guessed it." Olivia, the wife of a mid-level manager, listened with the avid curiosity with which one usually follows others' dramas, already imagining how she would recount the story to her friends at lunch the next day, adding her own color and interpretations. "That's horrible," she sighed sympathetically. "Although, Jessica, you have to understand, cheating is a serious thing. People react in different ways." "But not like this," Jessica interrupted with feigned desperation. "I was ready to apologize, to get on my knees, whatever it took. But they've decided to destroy us. This is sadism." These conversations multiplied, spreading through their social circle like stains on a white tablecloth, and Jessica felt a morbid satisfaction in being able, at least with words, to strike back. Their most despicable attempt at resistance came when David and Jessica decided to attack Sarah directly. They waited for her in the lobby of her building one evening as she was coming home from work, tired, with heavy grocery bags in her hands. The sky above was a low, gray ceiling, threatening a rain that might wash the grime from the pavement but could never clean the filth from human souls. "Sarah, wait," David called out, his voice a strange mix of pleading and aggression. "We need to talk." End quote. "It's the problem adigla devinit." She stopped, turned slowly, and saw them both. David, haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, and Jessica, in a cheap jacket clearly bought on clearance that contrasted sharply with her former designer wardrobe. "What do we have to talk about?" Sarah asked in a neutral tone, devoid of emotion. "You've gone too far." Jessica stepped forward, her face contorted with rage. "Do you think you're some kind of saint? Do you think you have the right to judge us? You're nothing but a gray, boring woman nobody ever paid attention to." No wonder David looked for warmth elsewhere. Sarah smiled, and in that smile was so much contempt that Jessica instinctively recoiled. Warmth, Sarah repeated. You call your little trysts warmth? How sweet. I'd call it something else. Betrayal, for example, or cowardice, or just plain, simple sleaziness. Absolute, you're punishing us because you're unhappy, David interjected, his voice rising, almost hysterical. Because your life was empty and meaningless, and you can't forgive us for finding a shred of happiness. Happiness? Sarah set the grocery bags on the floor and straightened up. On my sheets, in my apartment, at my expense. You call that happiness? You know what I've realized these past few weeks? That for 15 years, I lived with someone I didn't know at all, a selfish man who only ever thought of himself. And that discovery, strange as it sounds, has set me free. Free? Jessica laughed hysterically. You're all alone. You're an aging woman with no husband, no family, no future. And you call that freedom? Sarah took out her phone and dialed a number without taking her eyes off them. Mark answered on the second ring. They're here, she said calmly. In my lobby, trying to intimidate me. Want to listen? She put the phone on speaker. David went pale as he recognized Mark's voice. David, Mark said coldly. Tomorrow morning at 9, be in my office. We'll discuss your future with the company. Spoiler alert, you don't have one. And Jessica, tell her that slander is a punishable offense. I have good lawyers. They'll find a way to make it stick if she doesn't stop calling our mutual acquaintances with her sob stories. Sarah took the phone off speaker, picked up her bags, and walked toward the inner door. At the entrance, she turned one last time. You know what your biggest mistake was? You thought Mark and I would suffer in silence, that we'd just swallow the insult and move on. But we're not like that. We just happen to be smarter than you. And that, you have to admit, really stings, doesn't it? She went inside, leaving them standing under the gray sky, which finally broke open in a cold, autumnal rain, washing away the remnants of their feigned confidence and revealing what they had become. Pathetic, cornered animals, no longer capable of causing any real harm, only of snarling and whimpering. The morning greeted David with the alarming blare of his alarm clock, which sounded like a funeral bell tolling the final minutes before the inevitable. He lay for a long time with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, where cracks in the plaster looked like a map of some non-existent country, thinking that in 1 hour, his professional life, the life he had built brick by brick over 15 years, would completely collapse, burying all his ambitions, all his plans, all his illusions of his own importance under the rubble. Mark's office greeted him with a sterile cleanliness and the smell of expensive coffee that David once perceived as the aroma of success, but now seemed cloying, almost suffocating. Mark sat behind an imposing dark wood desk, his face impenetrable, like that of a judge who has already passed sentence and is now merely reading the formalities. "Sit down, David," he said, omitting his last name with a cold courtesy that was worse than any insult. "I'm not going to waste your time or mine with long explanations. You have 2 options. You either sign your voluntary resignation today, or tomorrow I launch an internal investigation for violation of corporate ethics. I think you understand that the second option means not only termination, but also a black mark on your employment record that will make finding a job in our industry practically impossible." David swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as if filled with sand. "Mark, I know I messed up, but this is 15 years of work," he began, his voice trembling despite himself. "Does one mistake really cancel out everything else?" "One mistake?" Mark smiled without joy. "You slept with my wife for at least 6 months, judging by the texts I found on her phone. You lied to my face every day, shook my hand, talked business with me, and then you went and held my wife. That's not a mistake, David. That's a systematic betrayal. And believe me, I'm being merciful by offering you a quiet way out." He pushed a blank resignation form and a pen to the edge of the desk. The gesture was final. No discussion, no compromise, just a cold, methodical execution, dressed in a legally impeccable form. David picked up the pen with trembling fingers and began to write. Each letter was an effort, as if he were carving it into his own tombstone. When he finished and placed the pen on the desk, Mark picked up the form without even glancing at it. "You'll clear out your personal belongings by noon today," he said dismissively. "You'll turn in your access card at reception. That's all." David walked out of the office on unsteady legs, the hallway seeming endless. Each step echoed in his temples, and the stares of his colleagues, who of course already knew everything, because in offices, news travels faster than any virus, burned his back like hot coals. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting in a cafe with her colleague Susan, a woman in her late 50s who had survived 2 divorces and had learned to look at life with the cynical wisdom of someone who has seen too much of human weakness. Susan listened to Sarah's account of the past weeks, sipping her coffee and nodding occasionally. "You know, honey," she said when Sarah finished, "I understand your pain. I understand your desire for revenge. But revenge is a strange thing. It's like a poison you pour into someone else's cup, but you're the one inhaling the fumes every day. Sooner or later, those fumes will start to poison you too." Sarah stirred the sugar in her tea, watching the white granules dissolve into the dark liquid. They disappeared, becoming part of something else. "I can't stop," she confessed quietly. "Every time I think it's enough, that they've gotten what they deserve." I remember that day. I remember her voice from the bedroom. His face, that mix of guilt and fear, and the anger comes back, as fresh as it was in the first moment. "And Mark?" Susan asked shrewdly. "Is he trapped in that anger too?" Sarah grew thoughtful, remembering her last late-night phone call with Mark, when he had called for no apparent reason, and they had talked about trivial things, the weather, the news, small talk. And there had been something in his voice that had put her on edge, a weariness that wasn't there before. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Sometimes it feels like we're both playing a game where we made up the rules, but we've forgotten why we started playing in the first place." At that moment, Jessica was sitting in line at the unemployment office, in a sterile government building with peeling walls and the smell of old documents, surrounded by equally lost people looking for work and hope at the same time. She felt the last crumbs of her self-esteem crumbling like the plaster on those very walls. Next to her sat an old woman with a shopping bag that smelled of onions and cheap soap, and a young man in a shabby jacket who was nervously fidgeting with his phone, vaping despite the no smoking sign. "How did I get here?" Jessica thought, a knot of shame, anger, and despair churning inside her. "I was the wife of a successful man. I lived in a beautiful apartment. I wore designer dresses. And now I'm sitting in this dump, waiting to be offered a job as a cleaner or a cashier at a gas station." Her name was called. A tired-looking caseworker in her 50s with an indifferent expression reviewed Jessica's documents and said monotonously, "You have a degree, but there's a long gap in your work history. You haven't worked for the last several years." "I was a housewife," Jessica replied, the words sounding almost like an excuse. "My husband supported the family." "I see." The caseworker typed something into her computer. "What are your skills?" Jessica opened her mouth and realized she didn't know what to say. What were her skills? Looking pretty? Making small talk? Spending someone else's money on nice things? Those weren't skills you could put on a resume. "I studied accounting," she finally managed. "A long time ago." "But are you familiar with the new software? The new accounting standards?" "No, but I can learn." And the caseworker looked at her with a pity that was worse than contempt. "Look, I'll be honest with you. Without updated skills, with such a long career gap, and at your age, finding something decent will be difficult. I can offer you positions as a retail clerk, a janitor, a nursing home aide. Take your pick." Jessica walked out of the unemployment office with a printout of job listings in her hand, the wind whipping the paper as if trying to snatch it away. And she suddenly thought that maybe that would be for the best if the wind just took these humiliating offers and she could pretend they didn't exist, that her life hadn't so quickly and ruthlessly turned to ruins. That evening, Sarah met with Mark again. It had become a habit, these meetings, where they discussed their revenge, shared news of the cheater's suffering, and found a morbid satisfaction in it. But today, something was different. Mark didn't seem satisfied, but tired. And when he talked about how David had cleared out his desk, there was none of the usual gloating in his voice. "You know, I was watching him," he said, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hands, and I suddenly thought, so now what? We've broken him. We've broken Jessica. We've destroyed their lives. And do I feel any better for it? Sarah looked at him and couldn't find an answer, because she had been asking herself the same question every night before she went to sleep. 2 months had passed since the day everything fell apart. Autumn had given way to an early winter, the kind where the snow hasn't yet covered the ground in a thick blanket but just dusts it with a gray powder, making the world look bleak and damp. It was as if nature itself was stuck in a state of suspension between seasons, unable to decide between the cold and the last vestiges of warmth. Sarah had moved out of David's apartment and now stood by the window of her own one-bedroom place, which, out of unfamiliarity, felt too large for one person. She looked down at the courtyard, where children in brightly colored jackets were building the first snowman of the season, their laughter reaching her through the glass, muffled, like a sound from another, happier reality. Her phone vibrated. A text from Mark. "Need to see you, urgent." What could have happened? She wondered, frowning. In recent weeks, their meetings had become less frequent, as if they had both tacitly agreed that the theme of revenge had exhausted itself, becoming an obsessive idea that poisoned more than it satisfied. And now, this urgent message sounded alarming, like a distress signal from a sinking ship. They met in the same coffee shop where they had once planned their vengeance. Ironic, Sarah thought, how life brings you full circle, returning you to the same places, but as completely different people. Mark looked agitated. His hands, usually calm and steady, nervously fiddled with a napkin on the table, turning it into a formless lump. "Jessica's in the hospital," he blurted out without preamble, his voice sounding strange, not triumphant, as one might expect from someone who had been methodically destroying the life of his unfaithful wife, but worried, almost scared. "Last night she tried to, well, you know." Sarah felt something clench inside her. It wasn't joy at seeing the enemy finally defeated, but something opposite, akin to the nausea you feel when you realize you've gone too far and there's no turning back. "What happened exactly?" she asked, her voice sounding hollow, as if coming from a great distance. "Pills." Mark ran a hand over his face, the gesture so weary that Sarah suddenly saw not a successful businessman, but simply an exhausted man who had been playing a game without rules and now didn't know how to get out of it. A neighbor heard strange noises. They broke down the door. They got there in time to pump her stomach. "The doctors say she'll live. But, Sarah," she left a note. "You know what it said? Forgive me. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be happy." And silence settled between them, heavy, viscous, filled with everything they hadn't said aloud over the past 2 months as they methodically destroyed 2 people who had made a mistake. Yes, a grave, unforgivable mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, not a crime deserving of such a merciless punishment. "I thought revenge would bring me peace," Sarah said slowly, looking at her cup, where the tea was cooling, a thin film forming on the surface. "I thought that when they understood what they had lost, when they felt a pain even partially similar to mine, I would feel better. But you know what? I don't feel one bit better. I've just become a person I don't recognize in the mirror." Mark nodded, and in that gesture was an acknowledgement of his own guilt, his own blindness. "I didn't sleep last night," he said, his voice cracking. "I just lay there thinking, if Jessica had died, what would I have felt? Relief? Satisfaction? You know what? I realized I would have felt guilty. Because no matter how much I told myself she brought it on herself, that she got what she deserved, I was a participant in what drove her to it. Me, Sarah. Not fate, not circumstances. Me, personally. We've become executioners," Sarah thought, and the thought pierced her, cold and sharp like an ice needle. "We've become the ones who pass judgment and carry out the sentence, without considering whether we have the right, whether we aren't both judge and jury in a case where objectivity is, by definition, impossible. David's on the edge too," she added quietly. "His mother called me the day before yesterday, begging, pleading with me to talk to you, to ask you to give him some kind of recommendation, no matter how small. She says he doesn't sleep at night, he's lost 20 pounds, he barely leaves his room." I hung up on her before she finished. I thought, let him suffer. He deserves it. And now... She trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence, because any ending would sound like either a justification for her actions or a confession of her own cruelty. "We've gone too far," Mark stated. "We've turned just retribution into a sadistic delight in someone else's pain. And the worst part is, I don't know how to stop this, how to turn back when we've already done so much." Sarah looked out the coffee shop window at the people passing by on the street. Normal people with normal problems and joys, living normal lives where there was no place for extremes like a revenge that leads to a suicide attempt. A woman with a stroller stopped to adjust her baby's blanket, and that simple, motherly gesture suddenly seemed incredibly precious, real, and important to Sarah, unlike everything she had been doing for the last 2 months. "Maybe it's time to admit we were wrong," she proposed cautiously. "Not that we had a right to be angry, not that we had a right to demand accountability for the betrayal, but in how we did it, that we turned justice into cruelty." "Armendi, and what do you propose?" Mark looked at her tiredly. "Take them back? Forgive them? Pretend it never happened?" "No," Sarah shook her head. "I can't forgive David. Not now, maybe never, but I can stop actively destroying his life. I can let go of this rage that's eating me from the inside. I can try to move on, to build something new, instead of methodically dismantling the ruins of someone else's happiness." Mark was silent for a long time, weighing her words. Sarah could see the internal struggle on his face between the desire to continue the revenge and the weariness of it, between the thirst for justice and the understanding that his justice had long since become its own form of evil. "Deal," he said finally. "We stop, here and now." End quote. The hospital room greeted Sarah with the smell of bleach and that specific scent of public institutions where human tragedies become routine, where pain is measured in milligrams of medication and the number of IV drips, not in the depth of soul wounds. Jessica lay on a narrow bed under a gray hospital blanket, her face so pale it was almost transparent, as if all the blood had been drained from it, leaving only the shell of a person too tired to fight a life that had become an endless, goalless obstacle course. When she saw Sarah in the doorway, her eyes widened with fear, the animal fear a cornered beast feels upon seeing the hunter. She tried to turn toward the wall, as if that could make her invisible, protect her from another blow she was already expecting, not believing the blows would ever stop. "Jessica," Sarah said quietly, and her voice lacked the icy confidence of the past months. Instead, there was something else. Weariness, regret, something akin to remorse, though not complete, because she still couldn't fully forgive, and didn't know if she ever could. "I need to talk to you." "I know. Did you come to finish me off?" Jessica whispered, her voice hoarse and exhausted, as if she had been screaming for hours, though in reality she had just cried so much after being revived that her vocal cords couldn't take the strain. "To see what I look like at the bottom of the pit? To enjoy the result?" Sarah came closer, sat in the chair by the bed, her movements slow and cautious, like someone approaching a wounded animal, afraid of startling it with a sudden gesture. "No," she said, the words simple, unadorned, with no attempt to justify or explain. "I came to tell you that this is over. I'm not going to interfere in your life anymore. I won't meddle. I won't make your life impossible. I won't use my connections to get you rejected from jobs." Jessica slowly turned her head, and a glimmer of disbelief shone in her eyes, mixed with a hope that was afraid to show itself too much, lest it be deceived once more. "Why?" she asked. "Why now? Isn't this what you wanted? For me to be completely broken?" "I wanted that," Sarah admitted with a sincerity that took effort. Acknowledging one's own cruelty is always harder than accusing others of their vices. "I wanted you to understand what you had lost, to regret every minute you spent with my husband. But you know what I realized when Mark told me what happened? That revenge doesn't heal. It just adds more pain to the pain, multiplies the suffering, makes the world a little worse than it was. And it makes me worse," she added to herself, but didn't say it aloud, because some confessions are too heavy, even for a moment of candor. Jessica closed her eyes, and silent, slow tears rolled down her cheeks, as if she no longer had the strength for real sobbing. "I didn't ask for forgiveness because I knew I didn't deserve it," she whispered. "Honestly, I just wanted to be happy. Not out of malice, not for revenge, not to hurt anyone. It's just, Mark was always so busy with work, and David, he looked at me like I was special. It's stupid, I know. It's selfish and cheap, but it was the truth." End quote. Sarah listened, and two feelings battled within her: the remnants of anger, still smoldering like embers in a dying fire, and something new, akin to an understanding that people make mistakes not out of malice, but out of weakness, out of fear of loneliness, out of a desire to feel needed and important. And that weakness doesn't justify betrayal, but it makes it more human, more understandable. "Mark will give you a letter of recommendation," Sarah said, pulling an envelope from her purse. "A good one. He spoke to an acquaintance of his in another city. They're opening a new office for a cosmetics company there. They need a manager. The salary is decent. You can start over if you want. A clean slate." Jessica took the envelope with trembling hands, as if afraid it was another cruel joke, that Sarah would snatch it back and laugh at her naivety. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice broken with incomprehension. "After everything that's happened, after what David and I, because continuing to destroy other people's lives is becoming too costly for my own soul," Sarah replied, getting up from the chair. "Because I've realized that I want to live, not to seek revenge. This isn't forgiveness, Jessica. It's just a decision to stop spending myself on hate. It's coming." She left the room, leaving Jessica alone with the envelope and a hope that was timidly sprouting through the thick layer of despair, like the first green shoot of spring through frozen ground. That same evening, Mark met with David in a small park near his mother's house, on a wooden bench weathered by time and the elements, where young couples had probably once sat, dreaming of the future, unaware of how quickly that future can become a present filled with disappointment and pain. "I'm not going to say I forgive you," Mark began without preamble, his voice firm but not angry. "Because I don't, but I'm tired of hating, tired of waking up every morning thinking about how to make your life even worse, so I'm stopping." David looked at him, his face expressing such a mixture of relief and shame that Mark almost regretted his decision, almost, but not quite. "I have connections in the next state over," he continued. "A small company. They need a specialist with your profile. I'll give you a neutral recommendation. No details. From there, it's up to you." "Thank you," David breathed, and the words sounded sincere. "I know I don't deserve it." "You don't," Mark agreed, "but apparently I deserve to have some peace, and for that I need to let this go." And, Spring arrived suddenly, as it always does. Overnight, when the air fills with the smell of thawed earth and something more subtle, which could be called hope, if one weren't afraid of sounding sentimental. Sarah sat on the balcony of her apartment with a cup of coffee, watching the building superintendent sweep away the last remnants of dirty snow in the courtyard below. She thought about how 6 months had passed since the day her life had split into a before and an after, and how that crack, though it had closed over time, was still visible, reminding her of its existence at unexpected moments, like when she walked past her and David's favorite diner, or found one of his old t-shirts in the back of her closet that she had forgotten to throw away. The phone rang. The screen showed the name Susan, her colleague, who in these months had become something more than just a coworker, a friend, probably. Though Sarah still used that word cautiously, afraid of getting attached to people after the person closest to her had betrayed her so cruelly and banally. "Sarah, you remember tonight, right?" Susan's voice was cheerful, with a vitality that hadn't been extinguished by 2 divorces and a lifetime of disappointments. "We're going to that new restaurant they say has a divine duck à l'orange." "I remember," Sarah smiled. And the smile was genuine, not forced like in the first months after the breakup, when even a simple thank you to a store clerk took effort. "What time?" 7 o'clock at the fountain, Susan replied. "And, Sarah, one more person is coming. My nephew just moved to the city. He's an architect, divorced, no kids. I'm not setting you up on a blind date, you hear? Just introducing you to an interesting person. No strings attached." Sarah smiled, picturing Susan matchmaking with a self-satisfied air, as if playing her own version of chess, where the pieces were living people with their own hopes and fears. "Okay," she agreed. "We'll see. We'll see." She repeated it to herself after hanging up, thinking that 6 months ago, the very idea of meeting another man would have seemed like a betrayal of herself, of the 15 years she had lived with David. But now she understood that life doesn't stop because of someone else's betrayal, that she had a right to a new chapter, a new story that might turn out to be happier than the last. That same morning, Mark was in his office signing the papers for the sale of the apartment where he had lived with Jessica, that spacious downtown condo that once seemed the embodiment of success and was now just a collection of rooms filled with memories he wanted to get rid of, like old clothes that have become too small and uncomfortable. He had bought a new place, smaller, in a quiet neighborhood overlooking a park, and the first time he walked in, he felt something like relief, a sense of a fresh start. His assistant brought him coffee and timidly placed an envelope on his desk. "This came for you. It's personal." Mark opened the envelope and pulled out a short letter written in neat handwriting. "Mark, I'm not asking for your forgiveness because I know words won't change anything. I just want you to know that I've moved to a new city. I've started a new job, a new life. Sometimes I wake up at night and think about how different everything could have been if I had been more honest with myself and with you back then. But you can't change the past. Thank you for giving me a chance. I won't waste it. Jessica." He slowly folded the letter and put it in a desk drawer. His face showed no emotion, not anger, not pity, not satisfaction, just a weary acceptance of the fact that some chapters in life don't end with a resounding finale, but with a quiet ellipsis. David had found a job at the company in the neighboring state, a 2-hour drive from his hometown, and was renting a small apartment in a complex where the evenings were silent and empty, like a spaceship adrift in space. The job wasn't as prestigious as his last one, the pay was lower, the prospects uncertain, but he worked hard because he understood it was his last chance to prove to himself that he was capable of something more than just destroying his own life. In the evening, he called Sarah for the first time in all those months. He dialed the number with the same fear a bomb disposal expert feels deactivating a device, not knowing if it will explode or grant him the chance to finish the job. "Sarah, it's me," he said when she answered, his voice uncertain. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to come back. I just want to say, I'm sorry. For everything. For the pain. For the humiliation. For destroying what we built over 15 years. Sarah listened in silence. And in that silence, there was neither resentment nor forgiveness, but something in between. An acceptance of the fact that the person she had spent half her life with was capable of betrayal, but also capable of recognizing his mistake and trying to be better, even if it no longer mattered for their relationship. "I heard you found a job," she said finally. "I hope it goes well for you." "Thank you," David exhaled. "And be happy, Sarah. You deserve it." And quote, "Is this markless?" She hung up and looked out the window, where the spring sun was painting the clouds in soft shades of pink and gold. And she thought that maybe happiness isn't something you find in another person, but something you build within yourself. Slowly, patiently, from the fragments of broken hopes and new, timid, but real desires to keep living in spite of everything. That night, she met Susan and her nephew, Ethan, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and an easy smile, who talked about his architectural projects with such enthusiasm it was impossible not to be interested. And Sarah caught herself smiling, listening with genuine interest, discovering that life, apparently, did go on. It wasn't a betrayal of the past, but simply an acknowledgement of the fact that she had many years ahead of her and the right to live them not in bitterness and memories, but